What's up, guys? Welcome back to Jimmy Talks. So, I wanted to make a video on why communism never works, and the reason why I chose this topic specifically is because of all the Antifa ICE stuff going on lately. You all know, you all see the news and stuff. And I've noticed for quite some time now with Antifa, however you really say it, it doesn't really matter. I've noticed with these people that a lot of them are communist or socialist or sympathetic at the very most to communist ideology or extreme left wing ideology. So I've also noticed the flood of cultural Marxism in our institutions and government that pushes communist rhetoric. My friend in college the other day was telling me how one of his sociology teachers was pushing rhetoric that is sympathetic to communism, and the kids who didn't know any better were just nodding along like everything this professor says is true. Going to college does not mean that you are intelligent, and people try to use this as an argument in and of itself to prove you wrong if you disagree with their ideology. But I digress, and that's a different topic. Anyways, now I already know who created and pushed communism. Yes, I am a noticer, trust me on that, and I've been a noticer for going on close to a decade now as I rapidly approach or are already in what you call unk status. But this video isn't about that problem, the big nose problem. It's more so going to be on the flaws with communism itself. I have also noticed people who will say socialism is different than communism. The terms always get mixed up, which is not true. But I am going to tell these people straight up that socialism leads to communism, and that's by design, whether they know it or not. So before I even get into how bad communism is and why it never works, let me address this quote that I just said. Let me address communism light, or socialism. The original idea of socialism, as thought up by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, is all about eventually creating a full communist society. Socialism will lead to communism, is what they were saying. This is true even if some people who support socialist ideas don't realize that that's where it leads. The plan is spelled out in their own writings, like the Communist Manifesto and the Critique of the Gotha program. It describes a step-by-step revolutionary process. The first step is the revolution. The workers, or the proletariat as they call it, will rise up, overthrow the rich capitalists, or what they call the bourgeois, and take control of the government. The second step is the socialist phase, or the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is the in-between stage of socialism and communism. A small group of socialist leaders runs the state like a dictatorship to tear down the old capitalist system. That means they will end private ownership of things like factories, land, and resources and put them all under government control. They will remove all of their opposition, including old rulers, political enemies, or anyone seen as against the revolution. They will brainwash or re-educate, as they call it, everyone to think in a socialist way, and get rid of ideas like personal freedom, making money, or religion. The third step is then the communist phase, and this is supposed to be the end. This is the end game for them. Once anything that isn't communist is completely wiped out and people have been remade into a concept called New Socialist Humans, as they call it, the government is supposed to fade away on its own. What you're left with is a world without governments, classes, money, where everyone works based on what they can do and gets what they need. The big problem with this, though, and history proves this over and over, is that things always get stuck forever in step 2, the socialist phase. It's just wishful thinking to believe that a bunch of people who grab total power over the economy, the military, the court system, and the police will just give it up willingly to create some perfect, no-government paradise. Instead, this temporary socialist government turns into a permanent, out-of-control elite group, like the party bosses with Stalin and Mao being our prime historical examples, who ruled with an iron fist. That's why every try at socialism ends up with a brutal dictatorship full of poverty, secret police, prison camps, censorship, and millions dead, and not some free communist utopia. So when people say socialism is not the same as communism, and they push for socialist policies, they are, whether knowingly or unknowingly, and most of the time it is unknowingly because people just want to do right by others and that's fine, but they don't know any better and they're supporting the building blocks for this whole communism process, and that needs to be stopped. They're helping grow the power of communism and chip away at private property rights, which are the key steps needed to kick off step 2 of their plan, the dictatorship of the proletariat. History is clear here, and it's obvious. Socialism, no matter what it promises, always leads to communism. Now, let's get into communism itself and why it is a problematic ideology that doesn't work. At its core, communism's biggest mistake is getting human nature wrong. It's based on the idea that people are like blank slates, completely moldable and able to become perfect if you create the right social and economic setup. It claims that things that are inherent to human nature, like greed, ambition, and wanting to own stuff, aren't natural but are fake beliefs pushed by capitalism. The theory says that once you get rid of private property, a new socialist man will appear, and they describe this as someone selfless, focused on the community, and driven only by what's good for everyone. This view is catastrophically naive. It contradicts thousands of years of recorded history, observable psychology, and basic biology. Human beings are all inherently different, and in many facets such as talent, intelligence, ambition, and drive. The desire to improve one's own condition and that of one's own family is a powerful, universal motivator. Communism seeks to amputate this fundamental aspect of humanity by destroying the link between effort and reward, by doing stuff like the abolition of private property and the collectivization of production, meaning you work only as much as you can and to your means. It systematically destroys the incentive that drives progress. Why put in an extra hour of work if someone else gets the benefits? Why take risk or aim for greatness when you get the same reward as someone who barely tries? This system punishes people who work hard or have ambition and instead rewards those who slack off or just go along. It doesn't create a team spirit that it claims to have. It just leads to a lazy attitude where people think, they pretend to pay us, so we pretend to work. This isn't a small glitch or a one-off thing that you can fix. It's a core part of how the system works, which causes the economy to stall and making it hard to find good purchases and products and services. The empty grocery stores and the boring, identical clothes in Moscow and other communist countries weren't just a temporary problem. It was actually the natural result of an economy that doesn't use prices to guide production or reward people for doing their best. That is why everyone in this closed-off communist society wanted to get their hands on anything Western-made, whether it was music, clothing, movies, guns, food, or whatever it was, because it was quality. Next, let's talk about the economic problems that communist countries have. So, beyond the issue of people not being motivated to work hard, there's an even bigger economic problem called the calculation problem, explained by economist Ludwig von Mises. So, in a free market, prices aren't just random numbers that someone decided they're just going to sell something for. They're actually like a vital signal. They carry important information about what's scarce and what people want to buy, how much raw material is available, and what millions of people value at any given time. For example, if the price of steel goes up, it signals to businesses that steel is in demand, so they should make more or find substitutes. If the price drops, it means there's too much steel around. A communist command economy, however, abolishes this pricing mechanism. Without private ownership of the means of production, there can be no genuine market for goods, and therefore no market-generated prices for them. A central planning committee, no matter how brilliant or well-intentioned, is utterly incapable of processing the billions of data points required to efficiently allocate resources for an entire nation. It is like trying to solve a galaxy-sized jigsaw puzzle in the dark. You just can't do it. The planners cannot know whether it is more efficient to build a factory with more steel and less concrete, or vice versa, because they have no real price for either to guide them. They cannot know if producing 1 million pairs of less shoes and only 500,000 pair of right shoes meets consumer demand, because demand is expressed through purchases, not bureaucratic decree. The result of this is a constant, systemic misallocation of what the country produces, like a bunch of unwanted goods alongside a crippling shortage of essential items. Factories produce not what people need, but what the planners in their plan dictates, leading to outcomes like the Soviet Union producing amongst the world's largest quantities of steel and coal, while its citizens lacked basic appliances in their homes and endured housing shortages as well. Communists will blame World War II as the reason for housing shortages due to them all being blown up, and while that is a valid reason for any country, really, this shortage happened before the war even started, and for much longer even after the war. So this argument doesn't stand up when it's scrutinized. The problem isn't just that communism was done wrong, it's simply just that the whole idea doesn't work. A modern economy is too complex to be controlled by a few people at the top. There's just too much information, it's spread out everywhere, and it changes too fast for anyone to keep up. The only way to manage it is through a market system where prices, profits, and losses guide decisions from the ground up. Every time a government tries to plan everything centrally, it leads to huge waste and poverty. The few communist countries that did see some success, like China after the 1980s, only got there by giving up on central planning and using market ideas instead. And this is basically just admitting that the original system was broken. Now, let's move on from that, and I will tell you how communism always turns into a small group of elite ruling class and not the classless, stateless society it claims to be eventually. So, basically, the political structure of communism guarantees a clear segue into tyranny. This is not a glitch that needs to be patched, it is a feature. Marxist-Leninist theory explicitly states, for, as we said earlier about socialism and a step 2 in their plan, a dictatorship of the proletariat to be carried out, specifically by what they call a vanguard party of, air quote, enlightened revolutionaries. This group and future elite of the communist system is tasked with seizing control of the government and using their government power once they are in to dismantle the old society, suppress counter-revolutionary elements, or, in other words, anyone who doesn't agree with them, and to re-educate the population until the communist utopia is achieved and the state can wither away. They have to force it upon everybody. That's how good it is. They can't just agree to it because it's good on its own. They have to force it onto you. Do you see the disconnect here? Anyways, we have seen many instances throughout history of Soviet re-education camps. They are famously known as gulags, and they'd be starved out and beaten into submission or just killed if they didn't comply. They were forced labor camps. The purpose of the Gulag was to isolate and eliminate people who were perceived as enemies of the state, like political dissidents, intellectuals, artists, Christian clergy, and anyone who was deemed a threat to the Communist Party's authority. The conditions were brutally inhumane by design. More on that later, but anyways, back to what I was saying. This theory that a small group of people will take over the government, get a bunch of newfound power, and then be totally benevolent with it, is perhaps the most dangerously naive concept ever conceived. It assumes that a small group of people with absolute, unaccountable power over every aspect of life, for everyone in the country, like the economy, the justice system, the media, the military, and even personal thought, will just voluntarily relinquish that power. History offers no example of any elite willingly dissolving its own authority. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts even more. The air quote vanguard party, as they call it, does not dismantle the class structure like communism says it will. It simply becomes the new ruling class. The proper term for this is the nomenklatura. It means that the people the communists want in power will install them. So the ideology provides the perfect moral justification for this permanent dictatorship. Since the party alone possesses the air quote scientific truth of Marxism-Leninism, any opposition is, by definition, incorrect, counter-revolutionary, and an enemy of the people. Dissent is not a difference of opinion to these people. It is a pathological illness to be cured through re-education camps, like the gulags, or to just simply be executed. This framework justifies the creation that characterizes every communist regime. The secret police like the NKVD in Soviet Russia, the Stasi in East Germany, and the Securitate in Romania, as well as the network of informants, the gulags, the Laogai, which is the Chinese version of the Soviet gulags, and the execution walls. This is why the no true communism argument is so intellectually bankrupt. I will get to this later on in the video when I discuss common communist arguments and then I dismantle them, but anyways, the idea of a small group of leaders taking control and making all the rules isn't a twist of communism. It's actually exactly what the theory calls for. The brutal regimes of Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, and the Kim family in North Korea didn't happen by accident. It is just what you get when you give a few people absolute power to chase a perfect society. And this is what they call for with their Vanguard Party. They are the elite ruling class. The claim that real communism, that is supposedly peaceful and democratic, has never been tried is just a convenient excuse that can't be proven wrong. Because as we said earlier, communism hasn't been tried. It always gets stuck in the socialist dictatorship phase, and it never goes further than that, because the ideology in and of itself is inherently flawed to even get to that point. So, every time someone tries to fully follow this ideology, the same oppressive system pops up because that's what the ideology requires. The repeated history of violence and suffering across different countries and with different cultures, with totally different people, proves it. Now, let's move on to the common communist rhetoric that tankies like to discuss, and they always say, communism achieved so much innovation, though. But the social, air quote, achievements touted by communist apologists must be viewed in their full, horrifying context. The innovation, where it did occur, was built upon a foundation of human suffering and are often grossly exaggerated achievements. What do I mean by that in simple terms? Millions of people will die. So let's talk about the beginning of the USSR. Russia, before the communist takeover, was a largely agrarian society and was behind the rest of the world in terms of modernization. It was like a peasant land outside of the cities. The communists then took over, killing millions to do so and executing Tsar Nicholas and his family in a very gruesome and brutal way. And now they were like, hey, we need to build up everything. We are an agrarian society. How do we build up and modernize with the rest of the world? And around this time, the Soviets started seeing Germany come around. They were anticipating World War II in advance. And they were seeing the Germans and the rest of Europe as a threat. And wanting to spread communism, need to be building guns and weapons and to gear up for war. I'm going slightly off topic with the World War II war, but I do recommend a book called Stalin's War by Sean McMeekin if you are interested in this sort of stuff. Anyways, the Soviet Union under Stalin did build up its industries quickly, but it came at a terrible cost. The government, to get to the modernization of Russia from its prior agrarian society roots, forced farmers to give up their land, crops, and animals to create collective farms under the control of the state, which is like declaring war on the rural people. This led to the Holodomor in Ukraine and other famines that killed millions of people, and lots of them being Christian. More on that later on how communism kills religion, but just waiting for that later on in the video. Anyways, these weren't natural disasters like a drought or just a bad growing season that killed millions of people. This was man-made, and it was planned by the communist government to crush the farmers' resistance and take their food to support their city factories. Not only this was key to their industrial output, they also built huge industrial projects that were built using slave labor from the Gulag prison camps, full of people who committed the crime of disagreeing with the communists or being a church member. While the Soviets bragged about teaching people to read and launching space programs like Sputnik, they were locking up or silencing anyone who criticized them in prisons and mental hospitals and making them commit slave labor to get their projects done. Think of people like nuns, or simply just someone who said, I don't agree with the government. Yeah, those sorts of people. Just normal people. So whenever a communist says, communism achieved so much though, they don't even know what they're talking about. How was it achieved? It was achieved with slave labor, stealing from other people, and killing millions to do so. Now, they may say, well, that just happened in the USSR. That wasn't real communism. As we already discussed further how that argument is flawed. Now let's move on to China and Mao with their industrialization, which is pretty much the same story, just a different country and a different culture. Mao had a plan called the Great Leap Forward, and it was intended to rapidly industrialize China and collectivize agriculture, which, just like in the Soviet Union, resulted in not only just a large famine, but the largest famine in human history, claiming the lives of tens of millions. Mao, subsequent in what he called the Cultural Revolution in China, meant to get rid of the so-called capitalist influences, sparked a wave of government-approved violence that ruined countless lives, broke families apart, and destroyed much of China's cultural history. Millions of people died in this time frame. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge tried to create a perfect farming society, but it led to the killing fields, where they murdered about a quarter of the country's population, just for things like being educated or knowing a foreign language. Now, moving on here. We know that the communists created a lot, even if it was at the deaths of hundreds of millions, and it's kind of crazy that I even have to say that, because you can't even picture hundreds of millions of people. That's why it seems insignificant to these people. Okay, imagine the whole entire city of New York City going out, just they all died. Or all of Los Angeles. That still doesn't cover how much communism killed. But anyways, let's take a look at what the communists created specifically, since the claim is that they built so much. Even the provided social goods were of notoriously low quality. The social benefits communism promised, like healthcare and housing, were terrible quality. Everyone had access to healthcare, but there weren't enough medicines. The equipment was outdated, and you often had to bribe doctors to get decent treatment. Their universal housing was actually just cramped and poorly built apartments where too many people were squeezed into them. Everyone had a job, but that was just because the government was the only employer, and not working was actually a crime called parasitism. These systems weren't efficient in the slightest, and they were stuck in a rut, and they fell apart fast when the Soviet Union collapsed, and they had to compete in an open market which they hadn't been a part of for close to 70 years by that point. The argument that communism will industrialize and build a lot, and that these costs were necessary for development, the cost meaning hundreds of millions of human lives, is morally disgusting, as well as historically inaccurate. Look at nations like South Korea, Taiwan, and post-war West Germany, which achieved economic growth and developed into prosperous, high-tech nations without resorting to mass enslavement, famine, political terror, and killing everybody. They proved that development and freedom are not opposites, but can be mutually reinforcing. Now, let's move on to, yet again, another reason why communism doesn't work, and that is because they reject God and embrace atheism. Communism doesn't just fail economically, it's just empty on a deeper level. It's all about material things like money and goods, and ignores anything spiritual or beyond the physical world. Because of this, it attacks the things that give life meaning and help people thrive, like faith, family, and community. Communism sees religion as a harmful distraction from the party, calling it the opiate of the masses, and tries to wipe it out right away. Churches were shut down, destroyed, or turned into anti-religion museums. Priests and other religious leaders are jailed or killed. The government wants to take the place of God, pushing the party as the only source of meaning and promising a weak, non-spiritual kind of salvation through working together for the state's goals. Do we really think that the neckbeard atheism and communism is the answer? No. Communism views the family as a problem because it believes families promote the idea of owning private property. The government tries to take over the role of parents by brainwashing kids through youth groups, and even encouraging them to snitch on their own moms and dads if they are political dissenters. In extreme cases, like in Cambodia with Kampuchea, the communists who took over Cambodia, the state went so far as to forcibly split families apart. So they're godless and they hate families. Okay. Local communities and civil society are smothered by the all-encompassing state. Any organization not controlled by the party is viewed as a threat. Labor unions, social clubs, and charitable associations are either banned or co-opted into instruments of the state's control. The result is an atomized and alienated population, stripped of its natural social bonds and utterly dependent on the state for identity and purpose. This creates a society of profound loneliness, cynicism, silent despair, and a spiritual poverty that is perhaps communism's most deepest and long-lasting scar. Now, let's move on to common communist talking points that I see all the time online. It is pro-communist common arguments debunked. To understand the failure of communism, you must also be able to dismantle the arguments that attempt to explain it away. These communists, never in good faith by the way, faced with communism's string of disasters, resort to a very limited and flawed argument of talking points that is always designed to deflect blame from the core tenets of communism itself. Their arguments, while compelling to other communists, or simply put, people who just don't know any better, fall apart completely with historical evidence and logical scrutiny. Let's move on to the first argument. So, this is the most common one. Economic warfare stopped communism from flourishing. This is the first and most common defense. and that is the external blame narrative. This argument says that the failures of communist economies, where everyone was broke except for the elites, are not inherent to communism itself, but were caused by external pressure from Western countries. The United States, in particular, is portrayed by these people as conducting a form of economic warfare by using sanctions, embargoes, and sabotage, which they argue deliberately strangled the communist experiment before it could flourish. Communists will point to the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War, the Cold War trade restrictions on the USSR and the other Soviet bloc countries, and the trade embargo against Cuba as evidence of an effort to prevent communism from succeeding. However, the core failure is internal. The Soviet Union had immense natural resources, a large population, and control over a vast Eastern Bloc market with tons of different countries. Its inability to produce quality consumer goods, as evident by everyone wanting Western stuff during this time period, the ability to provide adequate housing that isn't falling apart, or chronic shortages like food, gas, and medicine, is a story repeated in every single communist country, including those with minimal Western contact, like Albania when it was communist, or North Korea, who currently is. Now, compare the economic recoveries of West Germany and South Korea, which had Western support, with East Germany and North Korea, who had communist support. The difference is night and day here. The market-based systems flourished and created prosperity, while the planned economies from communism stagnated. This demonstrates that the economic system itself, and not just foreign policy, was the primary determining factor of success. Not only that, but these communist countries also had self-imposed isolation. Communist regimes often isolated themselves by building stuff like the Iron Curtain to prevent their own citizens from fleeing to the West because they hated living there so much. The Berlin Wall was built to keep people in, not to keep sanctions out. We've seen the people who tried running to the wall to climb it, having to go through minefields, barbed wire, and sniper fire, which was located inside of the walls. It was not a defensive fortification against a foreign military invasion. Its guns and guards were pointed inwards, towards the East German population that it was caging like animals. Does that sound like external defense or internal defense? Sounds like internal to me, obviously. The economic failure created the need for the wall, not the other way around. Now, the second argument, as we kind of dismantled already, it is real communism has never been tried. The real communism has never been tried argument is a way that commies defend communism by saying the bad examples, like the Soviet Union, or Maoist China, or North Korea, or the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, which are conveniently the only examples of communist countries, weren't actually communist. They'll admit those places were awful, with brutal dictatorships, but claim they don't count because they didn't follow Karl Marx's original idea. Marx thought a perfect society would naturally come from factory workers in industrialized countries, not from forcing communism on farming societies through a small group of leaders. These commies say those failed regimes were either state capitalist or messed up versions of a worker state, blaming power-hungry leaders rather than the ideas themselves. However, here's how the argument falls apart, yet again once scrutinized, because communists don't even know their own ideology. So, the ideology predicts the outcome. And the idea of giving all the power to a small group isn't a mistake. It's a key part of the Marxist-Leninist theory. The plan, as we discussed earlier in the video at the beginning, calls for a vanguard party to take over the government and use total control to reshape society and the economy. But if handing that much unchecked power to a few people just naturally draws in those who crave power and are corrupt, then this is the result that you'll get. This creates a new ruling class that oppresses others. You can't just give a small group complete power over everything and be shocked when they use it to help themselves and refuse to give it up. Now, it's a pattern here, not an exception. It's clearly a pattern here. The same outcome always happens in communism. The corrupt elite live in luxury while the masses stand in line for bread. This occurred in every single nation that attempted to implement communism. The Soviet Union, China, Cambodia, North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, and all the other Eastern European countries that implemented it all failed spectacularly. When the same result occurs every single time across different cultures and different continents with different people with different values and different lifestyles, it is no longer an exception to the rule. It is the predictable outcome of communism itself. Now, for their third argument, look how many achievements communism brought to the world. Again, we kind of touched over this earlier, but let's get into it for real. Now, the third common argument, and my final one, is how the communists tout that the ideology would bring so much growth to the world. This line of defense is the argument of achieved social good. Some people defend communism by saying that, even though it had political problems like oppression and putting people into gulags and killing millions, and that's all bad and all that, but communism still brought huge benefits to society. They frame it as a net positive. They point out that communist countries quickly built up industries, got rid of illiteracy, and provided everyone with housing, healthcare, and education, while ignoring the fact that other government systems can do the same thing with a lot less murder of innocent people. They also argue that, despite all of this, at least communism made great strides in science and technology. The argument is that communism was a tough but effective way to pull poor and old-fashioned societies into the modern world, despite the heavy cost. However, this argument falls completely flat on its face, yet again, when it's scrutinized. Most of the production from communist societies were low quality and unsustainable. While the state provided basic housing and healthcare, it was known notoriously by everyone, its own citizens, mind you, for being low quality, extremely inefficient, and corrupt to the core, if you could even get your hands on it in the first place because of shortages. Only some people had an apartment, and there was massive housing shortages at the beginning, middle, and end of the USSR. And if they did have an apartment, it was often a small, poorly built apartment building, which also wasn't even pleasing to look at. They had healthcare, but it was constant shortages of medications and equipment, outdated technology, and needing to bribe doctors for decent care. This stagnant and mediocre system collapsed immediately upon contact with a market economy, proving it was never built on a solid foundation. Next, the next counter to this is the extreme human toll it even took to industrialize fast. These achievements were all built on mass murdering hundreds of millions of people. To put it bluntly, their strategy to industrializing fast, again, was to steal from people and kill a lot of them in a famine. Pro-communism supporters argue that the Soviet Union grew extremely fast with its industrial system. But the Soviet Union's fast industrial growth came from forcing farmers into collective farms, which caused disasters like the Holodomor and other famines that killed millions. While they improved literacy and science, they did it alongside the Gulag system, where millions of normal people with perfectly valid opinions on the communists were enslaved or just killed. Mao's communist China killed 50 million people, and the USSR killed 60 million of its own people. These aren't successes to celebrate from communism, and it's insane that I even have to say that, and that there is Americans who are genuinely communists. Instead, though, communism shows a system that treated people like tools to be used and thrown away for the state's goals. It is crucial to understand that these deaths were not the result of natural disasters or inevitable misfortune. They were the direct consequence of ideological policies that were implemented by a totalitarian regime that prioritized Marxist-Leninist doctrine and the power of the Communist Party over the lives of others, and the well-being of its own people. Well, guys, that's the end of this video. To sum it all up, though, communism doesn't work because it's built on three major flaws, which is an economic system that can't figure out how to manage resources, a political system that relies solely on oppression, and a view of people that ignores what makes us human. Its defenders make excuses like blaming other countries and bad leaders or point to a few minor successes, but the truth is this. The results are always the same. Millions will die for the elite communist ruling classes. Alright guys, well that's all from me today. I know much of my audience is already against communism, but I wanted to put this video out there to reinforce this. Iron sharpens iron after all. Show this video to people in your friend group or family that may need to hear it, and don't let them get engulfed into the cultural Marxism and communist ideology that has taken a grip on millions of fellow Zoomers in our generation because they're facing monetary crisis like not being able to afford a home and low-paying jobs. While these are serious issues, communism is not the answer, and it's too much of a free-flowing and safe topic to be supportive of in society, as well as in college, the workplace, and other stuff like that. God bless you all, and America first. Jimmy Talks out.